I have buried 3 good horses in my life, and I have shaken the hands of men I would not trust to hold my hat. But I have never, in 61 years of dust and weather, seen a town change its whole heart over one stubborn man and one half-blind donkey. If you have 10 minutes, sit with me. I want to tell it the way it happened, not the way folks tell it now in the saloon when they want to sound like they always believed. Because they didn't, I didn't either. We laughed at him. God help us, we laughed until our ribs hurt, and we are not proud of it now. So before you decide what kind of man Eli Hartwell was, before you decide what kind of men we were, let me ask you to do one thing the people of Cradle Creek would not do at first. Just watch him. Watch him longer than you think he deserves. Because the town that laughed loudest ended up weeping hardest, and somewhere between those two sounds is the truest thing I know about people. Stay with me through to the end. I promise you, the part you think is the joke is not the joke at all. The donkey went down in the middle of Main Street, and the whole town stopped to enjoy it. I remember the exact sound, a soft, almost apologetic thud, like a sack of feed slipping off a wagon, and then the dust rising slow and golden in the 4 o'clock light, and then the laughter. The laughter came first from the boys outside Prout's store, the way it always does with boys, sharp and quick before they even know what they're laughing at. Then the men picked it up. Then a few of the women, who covered their mouths the way women do when they want you to know they're being polite about it. And in the center of all of it sat Eli Hartwell, thrown half off the saddle, one boot still in the stirrup, his hat rolled into the gutter, and his arms wrapped around the neck of that wretched gray donkey like he was trying to keep it from drowning in 2 inches of street dust. "Get a horse, Hartwell," somebody hollered. I think it was Tom Beadle. It sounded like Tom Beadle. He always had a mouth that arrived 3 seconds before his sense. Eli didn't holler back. That was the first strange thing, and I noticed it even then, even while I was leaning on the rail outside the livery with a smirk on my own face that I'd give a year's wages to take back. He didn't curse the animal. He didn't curse the crowd. He just got his knees under him, slow, the way a man moves when his back has been broken once and never quite forgave him, and he put his hand flat on the donkey's heaving side and he held it there. Held it. Like he was listening to something through his palm. Then he leaned down close to that long gray ear and said something none of us could hear. And the donkey got up. Now I want you to understand something about the kind of place Cradle Creek was, because it explains the laughing, and a man ought to be honest about the laughing. We were a hard, poor, sun-cracked little town 2 days' ride from anything that mattered. We measured a man by what he could break and what he could carry. A good horse was wealth. A fast horse was status. The Prout boys had a matched pair of bays they paraded down Main Street on Sundays just so the rest of us would feel the difference in our chests. And here came Eli Hartwell, a grown man, a widower, a man who'd once owned the best stretch of bottomland in the county. Riding a donkey he'd traded a busted plow for, a donkey so old and clouded in one eye that the children had named it Sunday because it moved like it had all the time in the world and meant to use every minute. To us, that was the joke. A man who'd had everything, riding the lowest animal a man could sit on. It looked like surrender. It looked like a man announcing to the whole valley that he'd given up. And I'll tell you, a town like ours needed a man like that. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. We were all of us frightened people pretending to be hard people. The land could turn on you in a season. A fever could empty a house in a week. A bank 2 days' ride away could decide your whole life was a column of numbers that no longer pleased them, and there was not one thing you could do about it but spit and go on. We lived close to the edge of ruin, all of us, every day, and the way we kept from looking down into it was by finding someone standing closer to the edge than we were and laughing at how he wobbled. Eli Hartwell on his donkey let the whole town feel, for a few minutes a week, like it was not about to fall. That was his use to us. That was the only use we'd assigned him. We did not yet know he had another. I'm a rancher. Was anyway before my hands quit on me. My name is Cordell March, and I keep a logbook, have since I was a boy, a little leather thing I write the weather in and the births and the deaths of animals, and sometimes when something snags in me wrong, the doings of men. I went home that evening and I wrote, Hartwell's donkey fell on Main St. Town had itself a laugh. H didn't. Something in it I can't name. I have read that line 100 times since. I was closer to the truth that night than I would be for months. He'd come to Cradle Creek about a year before the donkey went down. Bought the old Maddox place at the dry end of the valley, a parcel everybody knew was cursed with bad water and worse soil, and folks said he must have been swindled or simple or both. He kept to himself. Came to town once a week for flour and nails and a small twist of horehound candy that he never ate in front of anybody, just slipped into his coat pocket like a secret. Didn't drink. Didn't gamble. Didn't go to church, which in Cradle Creek was its own kind of crime. What we knew about him we'd cobbled together from gossip, which is to say we knew almost nothing and were sure of all of it. We knew he'd lost his wife somewhere back east, the fever, somebody said, or childbed, somebody else said, and the two stories sat side by side in the town's mouth without anybody minding the contradiction. We knew he'd had money once and didn't now. We knew he rode a donkey, and to us that was the headline and the whole newspaper besides. What we did not know, what I would not learn until the worst week of that whole year, was why. The why is the story, everything else is just the dust. After the donkey got up that afternoon, Eli walked it. Didn't ride it the rest of the way. Walked beside it down Main Street with the reins loose in his hand and the laughter still trailing him like flies, and he stopped at Prute's and he tied Sunday to the rail, and he went in and bought his flour and his nails and his twist of candy, calm as Sunday morning, while half the town watched through the window for him to crack. He didn't crack. There was a moment in there, though, that I have turned over in my hands 1,000 times since, the way you turn a strange coin you found in the road. While he was inside Prute's, a little girl, the Cobb girl, Mary Cobb, couldn't have been 7, wandered up to where Sunday stood tied at the rail, and she did what children do, which is to ignore everything the grown world has decided and go straight to the truth of a thing. She put her small hand on the donkey's nose. And that old gray animal, which had just been thrown to the ground and laughed at by 40 adults, lowered its big clouded head and let that child stroke it, gentle as you please, and it made a soft sound low in its chest that I have only ever heard donkeys make over their own young. Mary Cobb laughed, delighted, and looked up, and there was Eli Hartwell standing in the doorway of the store watching her with an expression on his face that stopped my breath. It wasn't a smile. It was worse than a smile. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost he loved and could not touch. He stood there with his flour and his nails and his secret twist of candy, and he watched that little girl pet his donkey, and his eyes filled, and he turned his face away so she wouldn't see, and he pretended to study the price of lamp oil chalked on the post until he had himself in hand again. I saw it. I don't think anyone else did. The town was already turning back to its own business, its laugh used up, looking for the next small cruelty to warm its hands on. But I saw the old man's face come apart and put itself back together in the space of 3 seconds over the sight of a child and a donkey, and I tucked it away without understanding it, the way you pocket a key when you don't yet know the door. He came out, untied the donkey, and the two of them went home into the long red light, the old man and the old animal, both of them moving like they shared one bad hip between them. "That man," said Prute, watching from his doorway, "is going to die out there alone, and the buzzards'll have to ask the donkey what his name was." Everybody laughed. I laughed. I want to be honest with you, I laughed. The drought came in like a slow tide that summer. And a slow tide is the worst kind, because you keep telling yourself it'll turn. By June, the creek that gave the town its name had gone to a string of green ponds. By July, the ponds were mud, and the mud was cracked, and the cracks were wide enough to lose a calf in. The Prute boys' beautiful bays grew gaunt. The grass went the color of old bone. Men who'd laughed at Eli Hartwell in April stood in their dying pastures in July with their hats in their hands, doing arithmetic that wouldn't add up no matter how they pushed the numbers. I lost 11 head in 3 weeks, I'd had 40. And out at the dry end of the valley, on the cursed Maddox place where nothing was supposed to grow, something strange started to happen. Folks who rode out that way, and folks rode out that way now, because misery makes a man curious about other men's misery, came back with the same impossible report. Hartwell's place was green. Not lush, not a garden, but green at the edges, a stubborn living green in a year that had turned the whole valley to ash, and there were rumors he had water. Actual water. A man with water in that summer was a man with gold, and the same mouths that had named him a fool in spring started shaping a new word for him, an uglier one, a word with suspicion in it. I wrote out myself in early August, told myself I was checking on a neighbor, told myself a lot of things. I found Eli Hartwell on his knees in a shallow ditch with a short-handled shovel, and Sunday the donkey standing patient in the traces of a little stone-boat sledge piled with rock, and the two of them were building something. A channel. A long, patient, hand-dug channel running down from a seep at the base of the rocks. A seep so small you'd have ridden past it 1,000 times and never seen it, carrying a thread of water no wider than my wrist out across his land in 100 little branching veins, each one cut by hand, each one shored with stone the donkey had hauled. He'd found the one wet thing in a dying valley, and instead of damming it up and selling it by the bucket, which is what any man in Cradle Creek would have done and counted himself shrewd, he had spread it, thinned it out across every inch of ground he owned so that a little reached everything, and none of it was wasted running off in a flood. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "You come to laugh or to dig?" I didn't have an answer ready, and the not having shamed me. He sat back on his heels and looked at me then, and I saw his face up close for the first time in the year he'd lived among us. It was a kind face. That surprised me. We'd built a fool in our heads and pinned that name on him, and the man underneath the name had gray eyes that had clearly done a great deal of weeping at some point and a mouth that had decided, against the evidence, to be gentle anyway. "The donkey," I said, because I am a coward and started with the small thing. "Folks have wondered. Why a donkey, Hartwell? A man like you with what you'd had you could have kept a horse." He was quiet a long moment. He reached over and laid his hand on Sunday's flank, that same flat-palmed gesture I'd seen on Main Street, the listening one, and the donkey leaned into it the way a dog leans into the one person in the world it trusts. "A horse," he said finally, "will run from a hard thing it's bred to, smart of it too. A horse feels the ground go bad under it and it bolts and you can't fault it, that's just sense." He scratched the long gray ear. "A donkey won't. You can lead a donkey to the edge of something terrible, and if it decides the far side is where it needs to be, it'll plant its feet and walk straight into the terrible thing and out the other side, slow as judgment, and it will not panic and it will not quit. People call that stupid." He looked at me. "It isn't stupid. It's the bravest thing I ever saw on 4 legs, and I needed to be near it. I needed to be near something that wouldn't run." I didn't understand him yet, but I felt the edge of something, the way you feel a storm before the first cloud, a pressure drop in the chest. "Why?" I asked. "Why'd you need that?" And Eli Hartwell looked out across his hand-watered land, his impossible green, and he said, "Because I ran once, from the only thing that ever mattered, and it cost me everything, and I have been trying to teach my own feet to stay ever since." He went back to digging. I understood I'd been dismissed, not unkindly, just finally, the way a man closes a door he isn't ready to open all the way. I rode home slow. The valley was dying all around me, every fence line I passed strung with the kind of quiet despair that settles on a place when the rain won't come. And I kept seeing his hands. They were ruined hands, that man's. Cut and cracked and old before their time, the hands of someone who had decided that the only honest answer to a hard world was to put those hands into it up to the wrist and not stop. But here is the thing I haven't told you yet, the thing I almost rode past without seeing. As I was leaving, I passed close by his little barn, more a lean-to than a barn, 3 walls and a roof he'd patched with flattened tin cans hammered out smooth, and through the open side I saw that he'd built a stall. A good stall. Better than the house he lived in, if I'm honest, with clean straw a foot deep and a manger he'd planed by hand, and a water bucket he kept full even in the worst of the drought, full of the water he was rationing out of his own mouth. And it was empty. The stall was for the donkey, but the donkey was always out working beside him, so the stall just sat there, swept and waiting, the finest piece of carpentry in the whole valley, built for an animal that preferred to stand at the old man's shoulder in the dirt. I didn't understand that either. I was collecting things I didn't understand the way a magpie collects bright trash. But I have since come to believe that the stall was Eli Hartwell's way of saying a thing he could not say with his mouth. That he had learned, too late, and at a price I did not yet know, exactly what it costs to fail to make a place for the one you love. And that he would never, as long as he drew breath, fail to make that place again. Not for a wife, because the wife was gone, but for a donkey, because the donkey was what was left. And a man has to keep his vow to something, or the vow rots inside him. That night I wrote in my log, Hartwell isn't a fool, we are. He found water and gave it away to his own dirt instead of selling it. Says he ran from something once. The donkey is the point somehow. Don't understand yet. Ashamed I laughed. I underlined ashamed. It's still underlined. The ink's gone brown, but you can see where my hand pressed. The trouble started, as trouble in a dry country always does, over water. By the back end of August, the town was desperate, and desperate men do their thinking with their fear instead of their heads. Word had spread of Hartwell's seep, his green land, his thread of living water, and a notion took hold in the saloon that festered there for a week before it grew legs. The notion was simple and it was ugly, that one strange man at the dry end of the valley had no business keeping water alive in his ditches while good families, our families, real families, church-going families, watched their stock die in the dust. Never mind that it was his land. Never mind that the seep was on his property, and he'd found it and dug for it with his own ruined hands while we laughed at his donkey. Fear doesn't keep accounts like that. Fear just wants, and it dresses up its wanting in the language of fairness so it can look at itself in the glass. They called a meeting. I sat in the back of it. I want you to know I sat in the back and said nothing, and that silence is one of the stones I still carry. The saloon was packed that night the way it only packs when a town has decided to feel something together. The lamps were smoking. The air was thick with the sour smell of men who'd been sweating in dying fields all day and hadn't washed because washing wastes water. Mothers were there, which they never were, standing along the back wall with their jaws set, and I understood that this was the difference, that a man might laugh at a stranger for a year, but when his children's faces start to go thin, the laughter curdles into something with teeth, and he will go looking for someone to blame the thinness on, because blaming is easier than burying. And Eli Hartwell, the stranger, the joke, the man with the green land at the dry end of the valley, made an easy thing to blame. Tom Beadle stood up, of course it was Beadle, and he made a speech about community, and about how no one man should hoard God's rain in a year like this, and about how maybe a few of the men ought to ride out and have a conversation with Hartwell about sharing what he'd found, and how if the conversation didn't go well, then a thirsty town had a right to do what a thirsty town had to do. He didn't say the word take. He was too smart to say take. But Take was sitting in the room with us the whole time, breathing, and everybody heard it breathe. And then old Prout, who named Eli's death and laughed about the buzzards back in April, stood up slow and said the thing that I think saved Cradle Creek's soul, though it cost him to say it. I was the first man in this town to call him a joke, Prout said, so I figure I've got the most right to say this. We are about to ride out and rob a man because he was wiser than us and we are ashamed of it. That's all this is. Dress it however you want. He found water in a dead valley because he got down on his knees and looked, and we didn't because we were too busy laughing at how he got to town. If we take it from him, we are not a thirsty town. We are thieves with a good excuse, and there is no thirst on earth that washes that off a man. The room got quiet, but I have lived long enough to know that a quiet room is not a decided room. The fear was still breathing, and as the meeting broke up with nothing settled, I saw Beetle and 4 other men pull together near the door, heads low, and I knew the way you know a snake is in the grass before you see it, that they meant to ride out that very night and not wait for any town to give them leave. I should have stood up, I should have named it, I didn't. But I did do one thing, the one decent thing in this whole part of my telling, and I have held on to it on the nights when the silence shames me most. I slipped out the back, and I saddled my horse in the dark, and I rode for the dry end of the valley as fast as a failing animal could carry me, to reach Eli Hartwell before they did. I don't fully know why. I'd shared exactly one conversation with the man. I owed him nothing. But I think a person spends his whole life building toward a handful of moments where he gets to choose what he actually is, underneath all the laughing and the going along, and I had a powerful sense, riding through that black and rainless night, that I had reached one of mine. I came over the last rise above his place near midnight, my horse blowing hard, and I reined up. The night was the kind of dark that has weight to it, a moonless, starved dark, and the air still held the day's heat the way a stone holds it long after the fire's out. Somewhere off in the dead grass a nightjar was calling, that lonesome churring sound, and under it I could hear the small dry tick of the whole valley cooling, contracting, a land grinding its teeth in its sleep. My horse smelled the water before I saw it and threw its head, wanting to go down, and I had to hold it hard. Because Eli Hartwell was already awake, already out. There was a lantern moving down in his fields, low and gold, and I could see him by its light, and I could see Sunday beside him, that patient gray shape, and I could see that he was not waiting fearfully in his house for the men who were coming. He was doing something with the water, working the channels in the dark, opening them wide. He was letting it run, all of it. The thing they meant to ride out and take by force, he was, for some reason I could not yet fathom, giving away to the dry ground as fast as his ruined hands could open the stone gates, sending his whole hoarded thread of life pouring out across land that couldn't hold it, where it would sink and scatter and be gone by morning. I sat my horse on that rise, and I could not make sense of it. A man with the one valuable thing in a dying country, throwing it into the dirt in the middle of the night, hours before armed men arrived to fight him for it. And then the lantern turned, and across all that dark distance, I swear to you the old man looked straight up the hill at me, as though he'd known I was coming the whole time, as though he'd been waiting for exactly one witness, and he lifted his hand. Not in fear, not in warning. He lifted his hand and he beckoned me down. I want to tell you what was in those fields. I want to tell you what the water was really for, and why a man would ride a donkey into a town that laughed at him, and what was buried at the dry end of that valley that Eli Hartwell had crossed half a continent to be near. But the men were already on the road behind me. I could hear them now, hooves, low voices, the particular ugly music of frightened men who have decided to be brave about the wrong thing. And the old man was still standing in his flooding field with his hand raised, waiting for me to choose. I rode down off that hill with my heart going like a drum, and the closer I got the stranger it became, because I started to hear it before I could see it. Music, or not music exactly, a sound under the night, low and trembling, rising up out of the dark fields. It took me a long moment to understand that it was water, running water. The sound a country forgets in a drought, the small silver chuckle of it moving over stone, multiplied 100 times over 100 little channels, until the whole of Eli Hartwell's land was whispering with it. After a summer of nothing but the tick and groan of dying earth, that sound went into me like cold water into a cracked cup. I felt my eyes sting, and I could not have told you why. He was waiting for me at the edge of the first field, the lantern at his feet, Sunday standing patient at his shoulder with mud to the knees. And he didn't say hello. He just looked at me, that gentle, ruined face, lit gold from below, and he said, "You hear them coming?" "Yes," I said. "How many?" "5, I think, Beetle and 4 others." He nodded slowly, like a man confirming the weather. "Then we don't have long." He bent and picked up the lantern, and he said, "Come with me. I want one honest man to see this before they come, so that whatever happens after, there's one honest man who knows what was here. Will you be that?" And I said yes before I knew what I was agreeing to, because there are voices a man simply answers, and Eli Hartwell in that flooding dark had become one of them. He led me out across the fields, and I understood now why he'd opened the channels wide. He was not throwing the water away. He was using it, all of it, all at once in a single desperate flood, because tonight was the night it had to matter, and water saved is water wasted if the saving outlasts the need. He was watering everything, soaking it deep, the way you'd water a garden you might never see again, the way a man drinks deep before a long ride. And then the lantern light fell on the thing in the middle of his land, and I stopped walking, and the breath went out of me. Trees. Apple trees. 24 of them, maybe more, set out in careful rows, each one small and young and impossibly, defiantly alive in a year that had killed everything else in the valley. They were knee-high to waist-high, slender as a child's wrist, their leaves a green so dark and wet in the lantern light that they looked almost black, and every single one of them stood in its own small basin of earth that the old man had shaped by hand to catch and hold the water he was now pouring out across them. He'd hauled the soil for them. I learned later he'd hauled it for 2 years, basket by basket on the donkey's sledge, good soil from the one corner of his cursed land that had any, building up these little islands of life in the dead ground, one at a time, slow as judgment. "My wife," Eli Hartwell said, and his voice had gone somewhere very far away, "wanted an orchard, her whole life. Grew up in a city, never had a tree of her own, used to say the thing she wanted before she died was to stand under a tree she'd planted and eat an apple off it in the shade." He set the lantern down between 2 of the little trees. "We never had the money. Then we had the money and we never had the time. There was always next spring." "There is always next spring, March. Right up until the spring there isn't." I knelt down by the nearest of them without meaning to. I'm a rancher. I'd buried more living things than I'd raised that year, and I knew the look of a plant that's barely holding on, and these were not barely holding on. These were thriving. Somebody had loved them the way you love a sick child, hour by hour, refusing the loss. I could see where he'd wrapped the slender trunks in rag against the sun. I could see the little windbreaks he'd built on the south side of each one out of woven brush, so the hot wind wouldn't strip them. I could see, in the lantern light, that the basins weren't just dug, they were lined, packed with clay he must have carried wet from God knew where, so they'd hold the precious water instead of letting it sink straight through that cursed thirsty ground. Every tree was a year of somebody's life. There were 26 of them. "How long?" I managed. "How long have you been at this?" 2 years on the soil." He said, 1 year on the water, a lifetime on the promise." I didn't speak. You don't, in the presence of a thing like that. You hold still and you let the man lay it down at his own pace. He told me the whole of it there in the field, with the water running and the men coming, and I have never since heard a man tell the truth so plainly. They'd had the bottom land, the good land, back east, the best in the county, like the gossip said, only the gossip never knew why he'd left it. He'd built it up from nothing. He was a hard young man in those days, he said, hard the way I'd been hard, the way the whole of Cradle Creek was hard, measuring himself by what he could break and carry. And there'd been a sickness come through the year their boy was small. Not the wife, not first. The boy. He was 4, Eli said. And I want you to understand, March, the fever was bad, but it wasn't always a killing fever, not if you stayed. Other children took it that year and lived, because somebody sat with them and cooled them and fought it hour by hour through the nights. It's a fight you can win if you don't leave the room, if you stay. He stopped. His hands had gone still. I didn't stay. There was a long silence. broken only by the running water, and far off now, the first real sound of hooves on the road. We had stock dying, he said. A whole season's money on its feet and a sickness in the herd, and I told my wife, that I could ride out and save the herd and be back in 2 days, and that she could hold the fort that long, hold our boy that long, and that the money would matter when the boy was well. I told myself a man provides. I told myself a man doesn't sit useless in a sick room while his living rots in the field. I told myself every fine hard thing a hard young man tells himself, and I got on my good fast horse, my beautiful fast horse, and I rode away from my son. And the horse was fast, he said. God, it was fast. It ran from the hard thing like it was bred to, and I led it, and I was 40 miles gone by nightfall. He looked at me then. He died on the second day, while I was riding back, while I was making such good time on such a fast horse. My wife held him the whole way down because somebody had to and I wasn't there, and by the time I came up the lane she had already washed him and laid him out, and she met me at the door, and she did not scream at me, March, which I have prayed every night since that she had. She just looked at me, and she said, "You weren't here," 3 words. And then she went inside, and in a way that mattered she never fully came back out, and neither did I. The hooves were closer now. I could hear voices in them. She lived 4 more years, he said. We didn't speak much. There wasn't a road back across those 3 words. She got thin, and then she got sick herself, and that time I did not leave the room. I sat with her 90 straight days. I did not get on a horse once, and it didn't matter the staying because some things you can only do in time, and the time was gone, but she knew I stayed. At the end she knew. And the last thing she asked me, the very last, was for the orchard, the tree, the apple in the shade. And I said yes. I said yes, my love, I will. I who had broken every other promise by leaving, I made her that one, and I have spent everything I had and everything I was to keep it, because it is the only door left between me and her, and I will not run from this room too. She lived 4 more years, he said. We didn't speak much. There wasn't a road back across those 3 words. She got thin, and then she got sick herself, and that time I did not leave the room. I sat with her 90 straight days. I did not get on a horse once, and it didn't matter the staying because some things you can only do in time, and the time was gone, but she knew I stayed. At the end she knew. And the last thing she asked me, the very last, was for the orchard, the tree, the apple in the shade. And I said yes. I said yes, my love, I will. I who had broken every other promise by leaving, I made her that one, and I have spent everything I had and everything I was to keep it, because it is the only door left between me and her, and I will not run from this room too. He was quiet a while. The water ran. Far off the hooves kept coming. You want to know the cruelest part, he said, and he almost smiled, the way a man smiles at a wound that's too old to bleed. In those 4 silent years she planted things, little things, a row of beans by the kitchen door, some flowers, a scrap of garden. I used to watch her out the window with her hands in the dirt, not speaking to me, speaking to the dirt instead, and I thought she was just passing the grief. I didn't understand till after she was gone that she was teaching herself to wait, to put a thing in the ground that wouldn't come up for a season and trust the season to come. She forgave me a long time before she ever could have said it. She forgave me in beans and flowers while I was still too proud and too broken to see it. And I have planted 26 trees trying to learn the things she already knew, the things she tried to show me with her hands while my back was turned. That you stay. That you put it in the ground and you stay and you wait, and the waiting is the love. The whole of it. The waiting is the love. He gestured at the little trees, drinking deep in the dark. So I sold the good land. The land that took my boy from me, the land I rode out to save. I sold all of it for almost nothing because I could not abide one more season standing on it, and I came as far west as the money would carry me, looking for the worst, cheapest, most hopeless ground I could find, because I did not deserve good ground, March, and because I needed to grow her orchard somewhere it would cost me everything, somewhere I'd have to stay and fight for it every single day or watch it die. And I found this. The cursed Maddox place. And I found the seep no one else had bothered to look for, and I bought a donkey, "Why the donkey?" I asked, though he'd half answered me weeks before. "Tell me the rest of it." "'Cause I would not, ever again sit on the back of a fast thing that runs from hard things," he said. "I needed to be near an animal that stays, that walks into the terrible thing slow and does not panic and does not quit. I bought the oldest, stubbornest, most patient creature I could find, and I made myself a student of it. Every day I watch how Sunday refuses to run. Every day I learn the lesson my son paid for. People laughed. Let them. I wasn't riding a donkey to town, March. I was riding my penance, and it was carrying me just fine." That was when the men came over the rise. 5 of them, dark on darker, Beetle in the lead with a lantern of his own and something long across his saddle that I did not want to look at too closely. They came down fast, the way frightened men do, and they pulled up hard at the edge of the first field, and then they didn't move, and the not moving stretched out, and I understood that they were hearing it too. The water, that impossible silver sound in a dead valley. And then their own lantern light reached out and found the little trees, rank on rank of them, drinking, alive, and the men sat there blowing horses and stared, and not one of them said a word. I'll tell you what I did in that moment because I'm trying to tell all of it honest, the good and the gutless. I stepped up beside Eli Hartwell. I put myself in their lantern light next to the old man and his donkey, so that when they decided what they were going to do, they'd have to do it to a neighbor they knew and not just to a stranger they'd talked themselves into hatting. It wasn't bravery exactly. My knees were water. But I'd spent the spring on the hill, and I'd spent the summer in the chair, and I was done watching. If they were going to do an ugly thing, they were going to have to do it while Cordell March stood looking at them, and some part of me, the part that keeps the logbook, understood that this was the moment my whole quiet life had been bending toward. Eli glanced at me when I stepped up. Just a glance. But there was something in it I'd waited 60 years without knowing I was waiting for, and I will not try to name it because naming it would make it smaller. Beetle found his voice first because Beetle always did, but it came out wrong, came out smaller than he'd packed it. "Hartwell," he said, "we come about the water." "I know what you came about," Eli said, and he did not raise his voice and he did not back up 1 inch. "It's running. Look at it run. There's more here than you thought, isn't there? You thought I had a bucket I was hoarding. I've got a spring, a small one. It won't fill your ponds and it won't save your herds, I'll tell you that plain. There isn't that much, but it's enough to keep these alive, and it's enough that if you'd come to me as neighbors instead of as a posse, I'd have shown you where the seep is and you could have dug your own channels off it and watered your gardens at least, your children's gardens, the small green things that keep a family's heart up in a bad year. I'd have shown any one of you. I'd have shown all of you. Nobody ever came. You only came tonight and you came armed." The shame of that landed in the field like a dropped stone. I watched it hit each of them. These were not evil men. I knew their wives. I'd helped 2 of them brand in better springs. They were just frightened, and they'd let the fright drive, and now they sat in the lantern light of a thing more beautiful than anything they'd built that whole ruined year, holding their guns, and they could not meet the old man's eyes. "What are the trees?" one of them said. Young Carey, it was, almost a whisper. "What are they for?" And Eli Hartwell, who had just told me the most private grief a man can own, looked at these 5 men who'd ridden out to rob him, and I thought he would keep it. I thought he had the right to keep it, to let them sit in their ignorance and their shame. But he didn't. He gave it to them too. He stood in his flooding orchard and he told them about his boy, and the fast horse, and the room he'd left, and the wife at the door with her 3 words, and the last promise, and the apple in the shade. He told it plainer than he'd told me, if anything, stripped down to the bone, because he was tired and the hour was late, and there was no use left in him for anything but the truth. And I watched 5 hard men come apart in their saddles in the dark. Beetle was the first off his horse. He got down slow and he laid that long thing. It was a rifle, of course it was a rifle. He laid it down in the mud at the edge of the field like a man setting down something filthy he'd only just realized he was holding. And then he walked out among the little trees, careful, so careful, stepping over the running channels, and he crouched down by one of them and he looked at it for a long time. And then Tom Beadle, who had hollered get a horse, Hartwell across a laughing street in the spring, put his face in his dirty hands and wept like a child in that old man's orchard. His own boy, I learned later. Beadle had lost a boy too, years back before he came to the valley. Nobody knew. That's the thing about a hard country full of hard men. Every one of them is carrying a grave he never mentions, and they laugh at the strange man on the donkey precisely because he's carrying his out in the open where they have to look at it, and looking at his means feeling their own. They stayed till dawn, all of them. They took off their coats in the cooling dark and they got down in the mud and they worked. Nobody gave an order. It just happened, the way the laughter had just happened back in the spring. One man and then another and then all of them, finding the channels Eli had opened and tending them, clearing the small dams, guiding the water to the trees that hadn't drunk enough, hauling soil with the donkey to shore up a basin that had washed thin. 5 men who'd come to take water spent the night giving it, and the old man worked among them quiet, showing this one how to read the slope of the ground, showing that one how to listen to the dirt with the flat of his hand to feel where it was still thirsty. And Sunday the donkey worked harder than any of us, hauling load after load on that little sledge, never hurrying, never balking, planting those 4 patient feet and leaning into the traces and walking straight into the work the way the old man said a donkey walks into a terrible thing, slow and unafraid, and refusing, simply refusing to quit. I worked too. My hands were soft from a summer of doing my despairing in a chair, and they were bleeding by midnight, and I did not stop, because something was happening in that field that I wanted to have helped with. I wanted it on the honest side of my logbook. I wanted, just once in my comfortable cowardly life, to be in the mud when it mattered instead of on the hill watching. And I'll tell you a thing I noticed in those black hours that I've never been able to shake. The men didn't talk about what had happened. Nobody said sorry. Nobody made a speech. Young Carey didn't say I'm ashamed, and Beadle didn't say I came here to rob you and found my own dead son in your trees. None of that got said, because men like us don't have the words for it and never will, and trying to find them would have broken the thing instead of mending it. Instead they apologized the only way our kind knows how, with their backs, with their hands in the cold mud, with staying. Every shovelful of soil one of those men hauled was a word he couldn't say, and Eli Hartwell, who knew better than any man alive what it costs to fail to stay, received each one of those wordless apologies for exactly what it was, and gave back the only absolution that's worth anything, which is to simply hand a man the next basket and let him keep working at your side. The sun came up on 26 apple trees standing in soaked black earth, every one of them alive, and on 6 exhausted men and 1 old donkey, all of us filthy to the eyebrows, and on Eli Hartwell standing in the middle of it with the strangest look on his face, not happy exactly. I've thought about it for years, and the closest I can come is that he looked unburdened. Like a man who has carried a thing so long up so steep a hill that he's forgotten it had a top, and has just, without quite noticing the moment, set it down. They'll fruit in 2 years, he said to no one, to all of us, to the dawn. Maybe 3 in ground like this. He wiped his face with the back of a ruined hand and left a smear of mud across it. I'd like for the valley to have them when they fruit. I'd like, and here his voice did a thing, caught and steadied, I'd like the children to have the apples, Mary Cobb, the little ones. I'd like them to eat an apple in the shade of these trees and not know what they cost and not need to. That be enough. That closed the door soft. Nobody spoke. Beadle put his hand on the old man's shoulder, that's all, just laid it there the way Eli laid his hand on the donkey, the listening way. And the 2 men stood like that in the wet dawn for a moment, and then we all of us got back to work, because the channels still needed tending, and there is mercy in work when a thing has gotten too large to say. I rode home mid-morning, swaying in the saddle, used up and strangely full, and the valley I rode through was the same dying valley it had been the night before. The drought wasn't broken, the herds were still thin, the rain still hadn't come. Nothing was fixed. And yet everything was different. in the way that a thing is different once it has been seen truly. And I knew the town would not be able to go back to laughing, because you cannot laugh at a man once you have wept in his orchard, and 5 men who could not be silenced now carried the truth of him home in their chests. That night I wrote in my log, and my hand was so blistered I could barely hold the pencil. Saw what the water was for, saw what the donkey was for. We had a saint at the dry end of the valley, and we threw dust at him for a year. Beetle wept. I wept. Trees will fruit in 2 years. Lord, let me be here to taste it. Lord, let him be here to taste it. That last line, I underlined that one too, because something had begun to worry me about Eli Hartwell as I'd worked beside him in the dark. The way he stopped sometimes and put his hand to his chest, the gray that came into his lips when he hauled too hard, the cough he tried to hide in his shoulder. A man who has spent everything will, sooner or later, find that everything is spent. And I rode home that morning full of the orchard, and underneath the fullness, cold as the bottom of a well, a fear I did not yet want to name. The story got out, the way stories do, carried home in 5 men's chests and let loose at 5 supper tables. And by the end of that week, the whole of Cradle Creek knew what was at the dry end of the valley, and the whole of Cradle Creek was ashamed. Now shame is a curious engine. In some towns it turns to spite. A place will hate a man worse for showing it its own smallness. I've seen that happen. I half expected it. But Cradle Creek, for all its hardness, had a vein of something better running under the rock, and the shame in those people turned, instead, to a kind of furious tenderness, as though the town meant to make up a year of cruelty in a single season and didn't have the patience to do it slow. They came out to the orchard. They just started coming. Prout closed his store on a Wednesday, unheard of, and drove a wagon out with every length of pipe and every barrel he had. And he didn't say a word about it, just started helping Eli build a better catchment off the seep, so the water wouldn't be such brutal hand labor. The Cobb family came and weeded. Young Carey, who'd whispered "what are they for" in the dark, turned out to have a gift for grafting he'd never had cause to use, and he taught the old man tricks for coaxing a sickly tree that even Eli didn't know. Women brought food and would not be thanked for it. Children, Mary Cobb at the head of them, carried water in tin cups, 1 cup at a time, 100 trips, watering trees that didn't need their cups but needed, I think, their small fierce hands. And Eli let them. That's the part that undoes me still. A prouder man, a man who'd built his whole penance alone, might have sent them away, might have needed to keep the suffering private to keep it pure. But Eli Hartwell had learned the lesson all the way down to the bone. He knew now that a thing you love is not diminished by being shared. It is the only way it survives you. So he opened his cursed land to the town that had laughed at him, and he showed every last one of them where the seep was, exactly as he'd told the posse he would have. And he taught the men to read the slope of the ground, and he taught the children the names of the trees, and the dry end of the valley, for one strange golden autumn, became the place the whole town went to feel like better people than they'd been. I went out most days. My hands had healed rough, and I was proud of the roughness. I'd sit with the old man in the evenings when the others had gone home, the 2 of us on a bench he'd built outside the lean-to, watching the light go long and red over the rows of little trees, Sunday cropping at the weeds nearby, and we didn't always talk. We'd gotten past the need for it. But one evening he said a thing I wrote down the moment I got home, because I knew even as he said it that I'd want it exact. There were small things in those weeks I never forgot. The way Beetle, who could not say sorry to save his life, took to riding out at dawn before his own work to clear the frost-killed leaves off the channels, alone, before anyone could see him do it and call it kindness. The way old Prout, who'd built a wall of shrewd talk around himself for 40 years, would stand at the edge of the orchard of an evening, just looking at the trees with an expression like a man doing sums that finally came out right. The way the Cobb children invented names for each tree. They called the big one in the middle Mr. Eli, to the old man's face, and he let them. And I saw what it did to him to be planted in their mouths like that, alive, named, belonging to children in a valley that had laughed at him a year before. And the donkey. The donkey had become a kind of town saint, which would have made the spring version of Cradle Creek choke on its own laughter. Children who'd thrown dust now saved the cores of their suppers for it. Mothers who'd covered their mouths to laugh now sent their littlest ones out to ride on its patient gray back around the orchard rows, 3 and 4 of them at a time, shrieking with joy. And Sunday carried every one of them slow and sure and never once complained, as though it had always known it would come to this, as though it had simply been waiting, the way it waited at everything, for the rest of us to catch up. "You know what I was wrong about, March," he said. "All those years, I thought the staying was a thing you did alone. I thought penance was a private business, just me and the grave and the donkey, but look at them." He nodded down the valley toward where the last of the Cobb children were trailing home in the dusk. "They're staying now, too. They didn't have to. It's not their promise, it's not their grave. But they come out here and they put their hands in my dirt and they wait for trees that won't fruit till after." He stopped. He started again. "Till after a while. And I think maybe that's the part I never understood, that you can't carry a love all the way alone. Sooner or later you have to let other hands take hold of it, or it dies in your arms when you do." He looked at me with those gray wept-out eyes. "I'm glad you came down off that hill," he said. It's the closest he ever came to saying the thing, and it was plenty. There's one more thing from that autumn I have to tell, because it's the truest measure of what the man did to us. About a week before he took to his bed, Tom Beadle rode out to the orchard alone, and he had that rifle with him, the same long gun he'd carried across his saddle the night they came to rob the place. I happened to be there, sitting on the bench, and I watched him get down and stand a while turning the thing over in his hands, and then he walked up to Eli, who was tying back a branch, and he held it out. "I want you to have this," Beadle said. His voice was rough. "I carried it out here to do a wrong thing with it, and I can't stand to keep it in my house anymore. I look at it and I see what I almost was." And Eli Hartwell looked at the rifle and looked at the man, and he didn't take it. He shook his head, gentle as ever. "No, Tom, you keep it, but you change what it's for." He nodded down the valley. "There's wolves been at the Cobb's lambs. You take that gun and you go sit up nights at the Cobb place and you guard what's theirs. Same gun, same man. But you point it at the thing that takes from people instead of at the people, and by spring you won't see what you almost was when you look at it. You'll see what you chose to be instead." Beadle stood there a long moment with his jaw working. Then he got back on his horse and he rode to the Cobb's, and he sat up 4 nights, and he killed 2 wolves, and I am told that rifle hangs over the Cobb family's door to this day with a story attached to it that those children will tell their own children. That was Eli. He didn't take a man's shame away. He showed the man how to turn it into something with a use. He went down in October, the way I'd feared he would since the night I watched him press his hand to his chest in the dark. It wasn't sudden. That's a mercy I've held on to. He just got slower and grayer, and the cough he'd hidden in his shoulder came out into the open and stopped pretending. Young Carey rode the 2 days for a doctor, and the doctor came and listened to the old man's chest, and came out of the linta with his face arranged the way doctors arrange their faces when they've got nothing in the bag worth selling. "Heart," he said, "worn out." The kind of worn out that comes from a man asking a heart to do. For years, the work of carrying more than a heart is built to carry. There was no channel we could dig to it. We'd watered everything in that valley but the one thing that mattered now, and it was past watering. The town did not laugh. The town held its breath. They took turns sitting with him those last weeks, so he'd never be alone in the room, and I understood the awful grace of that. A town that had spent a year leaving a man alone now organizing itself so that he would not spend a single hour of his dying by himself. Eli Hartwell, who had run from one deathbed and sat 90 days at another, was going to be stayed, with all the way to the door, by a whole valley of people who had finally learned from him the only lesson worth the name. Beadle took the night watches. Beadle, of all of them. He'd sit there in the dark with the man he'd ridden out to rob, and he'd tell him about his own lost boy, the one nobody'd known about, and the 2 of them would talk low about their dead the way only the bereaved can. and I think those nights were as close to healed as Tom Beadle ever got in his life. I sat the last afternoon. The Lenta smelled of wood smoke and the bitter green smell of the herbs the women kept burning, and of the apples somebody had set on the sill, not from his trees. His hadn't fruited yet, but apples all the same, brought from town so the smell of them would be in the room. I have always believed they brought those apples on purpose, though no one said. So the man dying for the want of an apple in the shade would at least have the scent of one near him at the end. It is the kind of wordless tenderness that Valley had finally learned, and it broke me a little, sitting there, to smell it. He was very weak by then, and most of him had already gone somewhere ahead, but he surfaced near the end, the way they do, and his eyes found me, and they were clear. "The trees," he said. "They're fine, Eli. Everybody's tending them. They came through the heat. They'll fruit." 2 years, he said. "Maybe 3. "Maybe 3, I said. My voice wasn't working right. He was quiet a moment, then, "I won't taste it." And there it was, laid plain between us. The cruelest arithmetic of his whole cruel life, that he had crossed half a continent and spent his last dollar and his last strength and the last beats of a worn-out heart to grow an apple in the shade for a dead woman, and he was going to die before the trees bore a single one. He would never stand under them. He would never eat the apple. He had kept the promise with everything he had, and the keeping had cost him the having. The door he'd built between himself and her, he would walk through it before it ever bore fruit. I started to say something comforting and false. He stopped me with his hand, that ruined hand, light as a leaf now. "Don't," he said. "It's all right. You don't understand yet, but it's all right." He smiled, and it was a real smile, the first full one I ever saw on him. I used to think keeping the promise meant tasting the apple, standing under the tree, the reward at the end. But that's the fast horse thinking, March. That's wanting to arrive. The promise was never the apple. The promise was the staying, the planting, the waiting. That's the love. I've been keeping it every single day for 3 years. I kept it this morning. I'll keep it this afternoon, lying right here doing nothing, going nowhere, not running. His eyes drifted toward the small window, toward the rows of little trees just visible in the gold light. The staying was the whole of it, and I stayed. I finally stayed. He died that night, with Beadle holding one hand and me holding the other, and the Lenta full of quiet people, and the donkey, somebody had brought the donkey in, brought it right into the room, because where else would Sunday be, the donkey standing patient at the foot of the bed, the way it had stood at the old man's shoulder through every hour of every hard year, refusing, even now, to run. There was a thing that happened in those final hours that I have to set down, because it was the heaviest choice the Valley ever made, and I want it remembered honest. Near the end, when the old man's breath had gone to that long, terrible spacing that the dying do, young Carey said quietly that maybe a man of God ought to be sent for, that it wasn't right for Eli to pass without the words said over him. And it was true, there was a preacher a day and a half off who'd have come. But Beadle shook his head slow, and he said, and I have never forgotten it, no. He spent 4 years running to one deathbed and 90 days staying at another, and the one thing that man asked of his whole life was not to be left and not to leave. We send for a preacher, half this room rides out to fetch and meet him, and Eli dies down to a handful. He doesn't go down to a handful. He goes down to all of us in the room staying. That's his sermon. That's the only words he'd once said. And nobody rode out. We stayed, every last one of us, packed into that poor Lenta shoulder to shoulder through the night, and we let the old man go surrounded, which is the one gift he'd taught us how to give, and the one thing he'd never once had himself until that night. I have wondered since whether we chose wrong, whether his soul wanted the words. But I think Beadle had the right of it. I think the staying was the words. We buried him in the orchard. There was no question about where. We put him in the middle of the rows, among the trees he'd carried up out of nothing, basket by basket, so that when they finally fruited their roots would find him, and in whatever way the dead are part of the living things that grow up out of them, he would be in every apple the Valley ever ate off those trees. It seemed right. It seemed like the only thing that could possibly be right. The whole town came. The whole town. The same people who'd laughed on Main Street a year and a half before stood bareheaded among the little trees while Prout, who'd named the man's death and joked about the buzzards, tried to say words over the grave and couldn't finish them, and didn't have to, because everybody there already knew. We didn't put much on the marker. There was talk of a long inscription, his name and his dates in some verse, but in the end the valley couldn't find a thing fine enough to say and was wise enough to know it, so we cut it plain. His name, and under it 2 words that Beetle suggested in a voice that didn't hold steady. He stayed. That's all. He stayed. Anybody who didn't know the man would think it a strange thing to carve on a stone. Anybody who did know him would understand it was the whole of his life, and the highest thing the valley had it in itself to say. And Mary Cobb, 7 years old, walked up to the fresh grave when the grown folks were done failing to find words, and she put her small hand flat on the turned earth, the way she'd once put it on the donkey's nose, the listening way, the way the old man used to lay his hand on the things he loved. She didn't say anything either. She just held her hand there a while, a child keeping a man company in the ground, and then she went and stood next to Sunday, and the donkey lowered its big clouded head and let her stroke its long gray ear, and the 2 of them, the child and the animal, stayed there together at the edge of the orchard while the light went down. That's nearly the end, but not quite, and I won't cheat you of the rest. The trees fruited, not in 2 years, in 3, just like he kept saying as though he'd known. And I want to tell you it was a great harvest, baskets and baskets, but the honest truth is the first year they bore only a few dozen apples, hard and small and tart, scattered through the rows. The valley could have divided them up, I suppose, could have made a ceremony of it. Instead, without anybody deciding it out loud, the apples were left for the children, every last one. And on a gold afternoon in that 3rd autumn, I sat on the bench Eli built and watched Mary Cobb, 10 years old now and tall for it, climb up into the low branches of the biggest tree, the one that grew right over where we'd laid him, and pick an apple, and sit herself down in the shade of it, in the shade of a tree planted by a man she'd known only as the kind one with the donkey, and eat it. I've been afraid of that day, if you want the truth. Afraid it would feel like a wound, like proof of the cruelty of it. The man dead 3 years, and only now the trees giving up the thing he'd wanted and never got to have. I'd half dreaded the first apple the way you dread an anniversary of a loss. But it wasn't like that at all. Sitting on his bench in his orchard watching that child eat in the shade, I felt the strangest thing come over me, a thing I've only got poor words for. I felt him there. Not as a ghost, nothing so cheap as that. I felt him there the way you feel the sun is there with your eyes closed, a warmth on the face that you don't have to look at to know. The waiting is the love, he'd said. And here was the waiting come round at last into a child's hands, and the love was so thick in that orchard you could have leaned against it. She didn't know what it cost. That was the whole point. She ate it the way a child eats an apple in the shade on a fine day, which is to say completely, and without the smallest knowledge that she was the answer to a dying woman's last wish and a broken man's last promise. The apple in the shade, finally, after everything, eaten. I had to look away. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. The donkey outlived him by 2 years. We never let it work again, wouldn't have dared, and it spent its last seasons in that fine swept stall Eli had built and never used, and in the orchard, dozing in the shade of the trees, and the children loved it past all reason. When it finally went, old Sunday, we buried it in the orchard too, near the man, because by then nobody could have imagined doing anything else. And if you ride out to the dry end of the valley today, you'll find the 2 of them there among the apple trees, the man and the mule the whole town once laughed at, keeping each other company in the only ground in that country that ever turned green. I'm an old man now myself, older than Eli ever got to be, which is its own strange grief. The valley's greener than it was, the orchard's grown into a real orchard, dozens of trees thrown out from the first ones, and there's a second one now on the Beetle place, and a third out past the Cobbs, Because the thing about a man who teaches a valley to stay is that the lesson outlives him and goes looking for new ground. I still keep the logbook. My hand shakes now and the writing's gone bad, but I keep it. And sometimes on a long evening, I read back through the brown old ink to that first line, the one I wrote the day his donkey fell in the street and the whole town laughed. Something in it I can't name. I can name it now. It took me the rest of my life, but I can name it. We thought he was riding a donkey because he'd given up. We had it exactly backwards, the way frightened people usually do. He was riding it because he refused to give up, because he'd found the one creature on earth stubborn enough to walk slow into the terrible thing and out the other side, and he'd made himself its student, and he'd let it carry him, every patient, unhurried step, all the way home to a promise. We laughed at the slowest thing in the valley, and the slowest thing in the valley turned out to be the only thing that got where it was going. There's a young family moved onto the old Maddox place last spring. Good people, hard year behind them, the wife quiet in a way I recognize. They've got a child who's taken to riding out to the orchard, and the other morning I saw that child come down the lane toward town, and I had to sit down on my porch step and put my hand over my mouth, because the child was leading an old gray donkey, slow as Sunday morning, slow as judgment, in no hurry at all to arrive. I don't know what that family's carrying. I don't know what promise that child is learning to keep, or what grave it hasn't told us about, or whether the valley is about to teach itself the whole lesson over again from the start, the way valleys do. But I know I'll ride out there. While I still can, I'll ride out there and see.